Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Tobias Harker. Up until recently, my biggest headaches were client revisions, aggressive zoning meetings, and worrying about whether a roofline looked clean enough from the street. I'm an architect, which means I spend my days drawing calm, logical spaces while real life stays loud and messy. Then there is Talia, my wife. She works as a veterinary technician, and she brings that same steady, practical energy through our front door every evening. When she tells a panicked, snarling dog to just breathe, it works, and somehow that tone works on me too. We lived the standard suburban loop, the kind of neighborhood where Friday meant ordering takeout and staring at piles of laundry you swore you'd fold by Sunday. That comfortable, noisy routine was exactly why we built an escape. A few years ago, we bought a parcel of land near a small, quiet village. It came with a simple weekend cottage and a deep lake backed by a steep rock face. The cottage was fine, but it was still close enough to neighbors that it never felt like a true reset. So a second place went up, built long before anyone used the word Outbreak. I designed a log cabin that hangs over the lake, anchored directly into the cliff and reached only by a wooden footbridge. It wasn't a bunker. It was a quiet room with a view, a small wood stove, and windows aimed at dark water instead of paved roads. On good weekends, our phones stayed in a drawer, we cooked simple meals, and we let the rain do what it wanted. By the time autumn settled in and the gray skies wouldn't quit, everything out there was finished, stocked with basics, and waiting. We didn't build it for emergencies. We built it because we were tired and because true quiet is hard to find. The land started as an idea that wouldn't let me sleep. A friend mentioned a parcel outside a small village, part deep pine woods, part exposed rock with a narrow finger of a lake tucked between the ridges. The price was suspiciously low, mostly because the access road was a suspension killer and the back property line was basically a sheer drop. That cliff was exactly why I called him back. It offered privacy without the need to build a fence that screams, "Stay out." A simple weekend cottage came with the deed. It was more utility than comfort, but it had a roof that didn't leak, a propane cooktop, and a lockable storage room. I remember Talia walking through it that first time. She looked out the kitchen window toward the neighboring lots, which were empty but visible, and said, "This is fine, but it's still close enough that someone can wander over with questions. If we want to disappear for a weekend, this isn't it." I told her, "You're not wrong. In a village this size, people notice headlights and fresh lumber." The lake felt like the answer to that problem. A short, rough trail behind the cottage dropped through the pines and opened up to black water. Across that water, the rock face rose steep and clean. Fog hugged it in the mornings and winds slid along it at night. Most importantly, the stone ledges halfway down were invisible from the road and hidden from the village shore by the curve of the land. Standing there, boots slipping on wet stone, Talia followed my stare and asked, "You're thinking of putting something out there, aren't you?" I nodded and said, "A small cabin. Just big enough for two, hanging over the water where the only neighbors are fish and the wind." That became the obsession. A small log cabin anchored to the cliff, reached only by a wooden footbridge. It wasn't meant to be a bunker, and it certainly wasn't built to impress Architectural Digest. It was built to create distance. A cabin on the shoreline still leaves tracks to your front door, but a cabin over water has one approach, one narrow bridge, and a lot of empty space underneath. The design came naturally because it was the kind of puzzle I enjoy solving. Keep it compact so it doesn't announce itself. Keep it simple so we could build it with the tools we already owned. Make it warm enough for a rainy October without turning into a damp box. The first sketches were pencil on scrap paper, but the layout was clear. One main room, a compact kitchen wall, a bench by the window, and a sleeping loft to keep the floor open. Talia didn't care about roof lines. She cared about how human beings actually operate in tight spaces. She tapped the sketch and said, "Where do wet boots go?" When I pointed at the corner by the door, she added, Then give it heavy hooks and a rubber mat and don't pretend we'll stay tidy without a place to dump things. She also made me promise the bridge would have real railings, not some skinny artistic design that feels like a dare in the rain. The cliff work was the brutal part. Rock doesn't forgive shortcuts. Instead of trying to drive heavy equipment to the edge, we used the upper cottage as our base camp and moved everything down by hand. Lumber, hardware, and pre-cut logs went down the trail on a cart when the ground was dry, and on our backs when it wasn't. I even bought a heavy-duty boat winch and a spool of steel cable, planning to rig a cargo lift so we wouldn't break our backs hauling propane tanks, but we never got around to installing it. The winch stayed in its box in the storage room, and we did the work the hard way. A local carpenter helped for the first stretch, mostly to keep me honest. He watched me measure the ledge and said, "Build it like you expect a storm to lean on it, because it will. The wind comes down this channel like a freight train." The cabin sat on heavy pressure-treated beams tied into a stout frame, and that frame was anchored back into the cliff with thick metal brackets and long bolts set deep into drilled holes. The goal was simple: spread the load, stop any shift, and keep the wind from working it loose over time. Every fastener got checked twice. Every board that faced the weather got sealed, because swelling wood is how tight joints turn into squeaks. The bridge came next. At first it was a straight run of treated boards from the trail side to the cabin door, just wide enough for two people to pass if they turned sideways, with a handrail on both sides. The first time Talia crossed it, she kept one white-knuckled hand on the rail, paused halfway over the drop, and said, "If you ever hear me slip, you grab me. Don't think, just grab." I answered, "I'm grabbing you, I promise." And she gave me that look that meant she wanted engineering fixes, not comfort, so grip strips went down the next day and the decking got reinforced. Inside, the cabin stayed plain and durable. Exposed logs, simple trim, and furniture that could take abuse. A small wood stove sat on a stone pad with a metal shield behind it, because the lake air stays cold even when the calendar says it's still summer. The kitchen was minimal: one counter, one sink, a 2-burner top, and a small fridge. A battery lantern lived on a hook. Heavy wool blankets lived in a bench seat. None of it was survival gear. It was just the stuff that makes a wet weekend feel like a break instead of a chore. We handled privacy with geometry. The building tucked under the cliff lip, and the windows faced the water, not the land. The curtains were thick canvas. Outdoor lights were kept minimal to avoid light pollution. From the village, you couldn't see it, and from the lake, you had to know where to look to spot the roofline. On calm weekends, we made coffee, watched rain hit the water, and stayed quiet enough that even our footsteps felt like they belonged there. By the time early fall turned into week after week of rain, the place was finished and quietly stocked with normal weekend supplies. The bridge creaked only when the boards were soaked. The cabin smelled like cut pine and stove smoke, and that smell meant rest. Back then, it was simply our private edge of the map. The thought that it might ever become a fortress never really landed. It was just for us. Friday started with a deceptively simple plan: grind through the end of the work week, hit the grocery store, and spend 2 quiet nights over the lake while the rain did its thing. But work dragged late. The sky stayed the color of bruised slate, and the only thing keeping me moving was the mental image of the wood stove and a hot pot of coffee. Talia met me at the driveway, pulled her hood up against the drizzle, and said, "Let's keep it efficient. Food and supplies, then straight out of town." That sounded like our normal routine, which is why the next hour felt so disjointed. The supermarket was packed. People hurried under dripping umbrellas, carts rattled over puddles, and the automatic doors kept sliding open and shut like they were gasping for air. Inside, the warm air smelled like cheap bread and industrial floor cleaner. No one looked scared yet. It was just a busy Friday, and we shopped for the lake cabin, not for the apocalypse, but Talia's instincts kicked in anyway. Cans went into the cart first because they travel well and don't care about temperature. Pasta, heavy bags of rice, and oats followed. Coffee, salt, and a large jar of honey went in without debate. Talia picked up a family pack of chicken breasts, turned it over and stared at it for a second before putting it back. She grabbed more shelf-stable protein instead and said, "If the cottage loses power, raw meat is just a liability. We're not risking it." She added extra bandages and antiseptic wipes near the pharmacy section, tossing them in and adding, "I'd rather have them and not need them than be out there wishing for a clean bandage." It still felt like weekend prep, just heavier. The store speakers played upbeat pop music that felt completely out of sync with the rain tapping against the front windows. The checkout lines were long, but the vibe was standard impatience, not panic. Then every phone in the building screamed at the exact same second. It wasn't a text tone, it was the full emergency alert system, the harsh, jarring screech you usually only hear for tornadoes or national tests. Screens lit up across the lanes like a wave of white light. My phone vibrated violently against the cart basket. Talia's hand tightened on the handle until her knuckles turned white, and she didn't move until she finished reading. The message was short, official, and terrifying. Emergency directive. Return home immediately. Shelter in place. Lock doors and windows. Avoid contact with anyone showing signs of confusion or aggression. Further information to follow. The last line sat there like a broken promise. The service bar on my screen dropped to 1. The message tried to refresh, and then the screen froze. The atmosphere in the store shattered. A man near the dairy case shouted, "What does that even mean?" loud enough that heads snapped in his direction. A woman near the bread aisle grabbed her kid's arm too hard and said, "We're leaving, right now." Someone laughed nervously and called it a drill, but they stopped laughing when nobody joined in. The place changed in a heartbeat. Carts started moving with aggression instead of aimlessness. People rushed toward the water aisle. A guy tore open a shrink-wrapped pallet, and plastic bottles rolled across the floor. An employee shouted for everyone to stay calm, his voice cracking. Another employee pulled a metal security gate partway across a side entrance, as if closing the building might protect it from whatever was out there. At the registers, card readers lagged and cashiers kept scanning items with tight, pale faces as if the rhythmic beeping was the only thing holding society together. Talia leaned in close so I could hear her over the rising noise of the crowd. She kept her eyes scanning the exits and said, "We've never gotten an alert like that. Not once. Snowstorms get warnings, tornadoes get warnings. This isn't weather. It didn't tell us where to go for help. It told us to hide." I nodded, feeling the adrenaline spike, and watched a security guard jog past, talking into a radio that spat nothing but static. When the radio crackled, a couple near the front flinched like they expected gunfire. We made the decision instantly. Pay and leave. No extra loops for snacks, no browsing. Talia stood shoulder to shoulder with me in line and said, "If we go back to the suburban house, we're stuck in the same grid as everyone else. If people start losing it, that's a lot of doors close together." Her gaze stayed locked on the front doors as she added, "The cottage is in a village, but the lake cabin is our real distance. That's where we go." That was the first time she said it like a survival plan rather than a vacation. When our turn finally came, the card reader hesitated, spinning for an agonizing 10 seconds before approving. The cashier looked up like she wanted to warn us about something, but she didn't have the words. We threw the bags into the cart and didn't wait for a receipt. Outside, the rain felt colder and the parking lot sounded wrong. Engines revved hard, horns blared, people shoved groceries into trunks without sorting anything. A man slammed his door and peeled out so fast his tires spun in a deep puddle, spraying dirty water everywhere. A police cruiser rolled through with lights flashing but no siren, moving slowly, like the officer was trying not to trigger a stampede. At our car, Talia stacked bags with the precise, forced calm she uses when an animal is crashing on the table. Her voice stayed steady as she said, "Lake property, not the suburbs. We go the back way." A bag slipped, cans thudded against the bumper, and she caught it before it hit the pavement. "We already have supplies out there," she added. And those words mattered because they turned fear into actionable steps. Traffic was already building toward the highway ramps, a river of red taillights. We didn't join it. Back streets carried us away from the shopping district and onto older two-lane roads that ran past the last rows of houses. The radio was a mess. One station played dead air. Another looped a calm, pre-recorded message about staying indoors, but the signal dipped in and out like it was struggling to stay alive. My phone kept the same frozen alert on the screen and nothing new came through. A few miles out, the first truly strange sight hit us. Two cars sat at a green light with nobody honking behind them, just idling in the rain like the drivers had forgotten what a traffic signal meant. Talia watched them as we passed and said, "Don't stop! Not for anyone acting off, not for anyone waving us down." The sentence came out flat like a clinic rule, and I answered, "Agreed," because it was the only sane move. The farther we drove, the darker the trees got and the quieter the world felt, as if the city noise was falling away behind us. The plan tightened into something simple. Get to the cottage, grab the hardware and the guns, and move up to the cabin over the lake before the crowds decided to scatter. If the alert was an overreaction, we'd lose a weekend. If it wasn't, we'd already be on the edge of the map with one bridge to defend and deep water under our feet. The village looked normal from a distance, porch lights glowing soft and warm through the rain, but up close the vibe shifted. It felt like the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. The main road was slick and empty until we hit the gas station, where the lot was suddenly crowded. Two pickup trucks sat parked at crooked angles across the pumps, doors hanging open, like the drivers had just walked away mid-sentence. We didn't stop. The wipers slapped a frantic rhythm as we turned onto the narrow gravel lane that led to our property. Our cottage sat back from the road on a pull-off, tucked behind a wall of firs that hide it completely in summer. But in late fall, the branches were thin and black, and the rain made the place look colder and more exposed than I remembered. As I killed the engine, a siren rose somewhere toward the town center, a long wail that cut out mid-note, like someone had thrown a switch. Talia stayed in her seat, eyes locked on the lane through the windshield, and said, "Sirens don't stop like that, not unless the person running them can't keep them going." Inside, the cottage smelled like pine boards and stale propane. It was a simple layout: a living room, a compact kitchen, one bedroom, and a storage room that held the leftovers from the lake build. The power was still on. The overhead light clicked, held steady, and somehow felt wrong, too bright for the mood. Talia set the grocery bags down on the floor and said, "We don't unpack. We inventory, we stage, and we move." She went straight to the cabinet where we kept the trauma kit, popped the latch, and started counting supplies under her breath. Cell service was weak out here, barely one bar, but a few messages pushed through the bottleneck. A neighbor from our suburban street texted, "Are you home?" A co-worker of Talia's wrote, "Clinic is closing. ER is on diversion. Don't come in." Nothing explained the alert. The silence between those jagged messages did more talking than the words themselves. The radio was useless. One station was dead air. Another kept looping a calm, pre-recorded shelter-in-place notice, instructing people to avoid hospitals and public buildings. It didn't sound like a plan. It sounded like a stall tactic. Talia listened for a minute, then looked at me and said, "They're not telling people where to go. They're telling people to get small and stay out of the way." The kitchen table turned into a staging area. Food and water went into one pile, tools and hardware into another, cold weather clothing in a third. I went into the storage room and dug past the boxes of screws and thick plastic sheeting until I found what I was looking for: the heavy cardboard box containing the boat winch and the spool of steel cable we'd bought years ago and never installed. I dragged it out along with a bundle of rope and a heavy-duty padlock I'd never used. In the pantry sat the weekend staples we kept for storms: beans, soup, tuna, chili, rice, oats, coffee, and salt. While we sorted, a video finally loaded on Talia's phone. It was grainy, filmed vertically from inside a car across an intersection. A man stumbled into traffic, moving with a jerky, broken rhythm. At first it looked like bath salts or a seizure. Then he lunged at another man, grabbed him with impossible strength, and tore at his neck like it was food. People screamed. The camera jerked down to the floor mat. The clip ended. Talia didn't replay it. She set the phone on the counter face down like it was contaminated and said, "That's not a fight." Her voice stayed even, but her hand went to her own throat instinctively. The attacker had moved slow and heavy, like pain didn't register. "If that's real, it spreads fast," I said, and she answered, "And the village is close. Too close." Another clip pinged in a minute later, this one from a hospital entrance where security was trying to hold a surging crowd back. A person in scrubs was yelling. Someone from the crowd lunged. Bodies went down in a violent knot. The audio cut out, but the movement told the story. The system wasn't bending, it was breaking. A hard knock hit the cottage door and rattled the glass pane. Both of us froze. I moved to the side window, lifted the curtain a half-inch, and saw a man on the porch in a yellow rain jacket, hood up, hands held out to show he wasn't holding a weapon. It was one of the seasonal neighbors, a guy who rented a place closer to the lake in the summer. He leaned toward the door, trying to see past the reflection, and called out, "Hey, anybody in there? I saw the car, we got an alert. Do you know what's going on?" Talia kept her voice low, barely a whisper, and said, "Don't open it, not for anyone." I kept the deadbolt thrown and spoke through the heavy wood door. I said, "We don't know anything, we're leaving. You should go back inside and lock up." He pressed closer, his face pale and wet, and said, "They're saying it's a virus. My girlfriend is down in town. She's not answering her phone. I need to know if the road is open." The lane behind him stayed empty, but a distant rhythmic shouting carried from somewhere toward the village center. The chain stayed on. I kept my tone flat and said, "I'm sorry, we can't help you. Shelter where you are." He hesitated, looked at the door like he might pound on it again, then nodded once, defeated. He stepped off the porch and walked back into the rain with his shoulders hunched. Talia didn't relax until the sound of his footsteps faded into the wet gravel. That knock settled the debate. If people were already going door to door, the village would turn into a pressure cooker by morning. The cottage had locks, but it sat on normal ground with normal paths. The cabin over the lake had deep water under it and one narrow bridge. It wasn't perfect, but it gave us distance and geometry. Talia zipped a duffel bag tight and said, "We go now, before everyone else decides they need the same idea." I grabbed the padlock, the coil of rope, and heaved the heavy box with the winch onto my shoulder. "We move what matters," I said, "and we don't come back for comfort." Then I opened the back door into the cold rain, and we headed for the trail that dropped toward the lake. The trail down to the lake was a mud slick after weeks of relentless rain, and the beam from my headlamp kept catching wet leaves that flashed like shattered mirrors. The grocery bags cut deep into my fingers, and the heavy cardboard box with the winch dug into my shoulder, shifting its weight with every step. I had to plant my boots carefully on exposed roots or jagged rock to keep from sliding into the brush. Talia stayed one pace behind me, quiet and focused, balancing the trauma kit and a heavy tote of food. The cottage disappeared behind the trees almost instantly. Down here, the air was colder and saturated with moisture, and the lake finally showed up between the trunks, dark and flat like a sheet of oil. The cliff face above it was a sheer black wall, and the cabin sat tucked under the rock lip. You had to know it was there to even spot the roofline. At the last bend, the footbridge emerged from the gloom, a narrow run of treated boards connecting the trail to the cabin door, with nothing but deep water dropping away beneath it. The rain made the railing shine under the light. The boards looked darker than usual, soaked through, and the structure gave a slow, mournful creak when the wind pushed through the gap. Talia stopped at the trailhead, tested the first plank with the toe of her boot, then looked at me and said, "One at a time. I don't want both of us on the span if a board gives way. Keep a hand on the rail and don't rush." Crossing with the gear made the bridge feel half as wide. Halfway across, a gust of wind hit hard enough that the wet railing buzzed under my palm, and I kept my eyes locked on the door handle, refusing to look down at the black water. Behind me, once I was clear, Talia moved with short, careful steps. her boots making that distinct wet wood squeak that carries farther than you think. The cabin door opened to dry, still air and the familiar grounding scent of pine and old stove smoke. It wasn't warm yet, but it was tight and clean. The bags hit the floor with a thud. I shoved the heavy winch box into the corner and stripped off my wet jacket. The entry area immediately turned into a drip zone, and Talia went into clinic mode, shaping it into something usable. She slid a plastic tub under the hooks for our boots, set a container of antiseptic wipes and sanitizer on the shelf, and said, "This corner stays dirty. Everything past this line stays clean. We don't track mud or whatever is out there into the living space." Heat was the priority. The wood stove sat cold on its stone pad, and I didn't want to waste time fighting damp logs. I grabbed dry kindling from the bin, struck a match, and the flame caught fast. Within minutes, the metal body of the stove began ticking rhythmically as it expanded. Talia held her hands near the cast iron and said, "That sound is the first good thing I've heard all night." Light was the next decision. One switch gave us a soft battery-powered glow, but even that felt risky, like a beacon that could travel across the open water. I reached for the curtain cord, but Talia beat me to it, pulling the thick canvas drapes across the windows and leaving only a thin crack at the bottom. Her voice dropped to a whisper as she said, "No light leaking outside. If we can see them, they can see us. We stay dark." We didn't unpack right away. Rain hammered the metal roof. Wind pushed waves against the base of the cliff. Nothing else moved. Then a sound floated up from the trail side, faint but wrong. It sounded like someone dragging a heavy boot through mud and then stopping. Talia's head tilted instantly. "Did you hear that?" she asked, and her hand hovered over the flashlight without lifting it. We waited in the semi-darkness. The sound came again, softer this time, then stopped completely. It could have been a falling branch, a deer, or the neighbor who had seen our car at the cottage. I lifted the curtain a finger width, keeping my face back from the glass to avoid a reflection, and watched the trail entrance between the trees. No shape stood there. Talia looked at me from the bench and said, "We need rules before we get too tired to think." She didn't need a notebook, she just listed what mattered. Nobody goes outside without saying it first. We don't open the door for strangers, no matter what they say. We don't shout across the water. If we hear something, we listen before we move. She paused, took a breath, and added, "If we have to go back up to the cottage for supplies, we go together and we come back before dark. No night trips." That last line landed hard because it meant we were already planning to stay for the long haul. I nodded and said, "Agreed." We treat this like a quarantine zone. We unpacked with that mindset. Cans and dry food went into the lower vermin-proof cabinet. Coffee went on the shelf by the kettle. Water bottles were stacked near the stove so they wouldn't freeze if the temp dropped. The medical kit stayed by the entry bench where it could be grabbed in a second. On the table sat the padlock and the coil of rope I'd brought down, and I kept looking at them like they were an unfinished sentence. That bridge was built for weekends, not for keeping desperate people out. If things got worse, the bridge would need changes, and soon, before anyone else found this place. Outside, the lake turned a deep, bruised black as evening deepened. Rain streaked down the glass in thin, distorting lines. The stove heat finally spread through the room, and the air felt dry enough to breathe without shivering. Talia changed into warm wool socks, sat on the bench, and said, "If this turns out to be a false alarm, we're going to feel incredibly stupid sitting here in the dark." I answered, "I can live with stupid. Stupid is better than the alternative," and she gave a short, dry laugh that didn't last. Phone service was barely there, ghosting in and out, but one video clip finally loaded in low resolution. A shaky camera showed a familiar shopping center parking lot, a person stumbling, and another backing away with hands up. The stumbling figure lunged and grabbed, and the audio dissolved into screams before the clip cut to black. Talia watched my face, not the screen, and said, "Turn it off. We know enough." The phone went face down on the table. The first night settled into a tight, anxious routine. Curtains stayed shut. The stove got fed in small pieces so it wouldn't roar and send sparks up the chimney. We ate cold food straight from cans, beans and corn, not because it tasted good, but because cooking smells travel on the wind. Talia cleaned her hands with sanitizer every time she crossed the entry corner and said, "Dirty hands are still dirty hands even here." Sometime after midnight, a distant shout carried from the direction of the village, then faded into the rain. Another followed, then nothing. The silence that came after felt worse than the noise. Before sleep finally took me, Talia whispered from the loft, "Tomorrow we move more supplies up here, and we make that bridge safer." Morning broke in layers of relentless gray, and in the daylight the cabin felt smaller. Not cramped exactly, just honest. The rain had eased into a steady misting drizzle, and the lake below looked like a sheet of hammered dark metal. Heat was the first job because warmth is control. The stove had kept us steady overnight, but it was a hungry beast, and wet weather turns firewood management into a math problem you can't afford to get wrong. A dry stack sat under the cliff lip where the wind couldn't reach it, and a much larger pile stayed up by the cottage under a heavy tarp. The rule became simple. Burn the driest wood here, keep the cabin stack small to save space, and keep the main reserve covered so we weren't hauling sodden, hissing logs across a slick bridge every day. Splitting a few pieces on the deck felt normal. A rhythmic chore, until I remembered the alert and the way the village sirens had died mid-note the night before. Talia made coffee on the stovetop and watched the entry corner like she was setting up a sterile field in a clinic. She held the mug in both hands to steal the warmth and said, "If we can stay warm and stay clean, we can think. If we lose either of those, we start making mistakes." And we did the inventory out loud, so we both had to acknowledge the numbers. Canned food for a week, maybe 10 days if we rationed hard. Dry food for longer, provided we kept it sealed against moisture and pests. Bottled water from town, plus the small weekend tank in the cabin. Headlamps, batteries, and the solar setup back at the cottage. Enough to start, but nowhere near enough to coast. Water strategy came next. The cabin tank was fine for dishes and quick wash-ups, but not for long-term drinking. With rain falling every day, we used it. A clean plastic bin went outside under the drip line where the roof shed water, and a short hose guided the runoff into it so it didn't splash mud into the supply. That water went through our gravity filter and then got boiled when we had the stove running anyway. Lake water stayed as the last resort because even if the outbreak wasn't waterborne, the risk wasn't worth a debilitating stomach bug. Power was a discipline, not a comfort. The battery system could run a few LED lights and charge devices, and solar would help on clear days, but the gray skies meant we acted like the grid could quit any time. Phones went into airplane mode. Charging happened once a day, strictly monitored. Headlamps stayed off unless absolutely needed. One lantern sat on the table turned low, and Talia laid down the law. If it isn't helping us work, it stays dark. This kept us from turning the cabin into a glowing beacon on the water. Food storage had to be aggressive. Rain brings mice, and mice don't care about your survival plans. 2 thick food-grade plastic buckets with screw-top lids came from the cottage stash. We wiped them down and filled them with the bulk items: rice, oats, pasta, and coffee. Cans stayed in a low cabinet. Anything smelly, like tuna packets, stayed double-bagged. Fishing gear came out too. Nothing fancy, just spinning rods, line, hooks, and a small landing net. The lake meant protein later, but for now we stayed quiet and saved that option to avoid drawing attention to the shoreline. Hygiene needed a real system before damp living turned into sickness. The entry corner became a rigid wash zone. Boots in the tub, wet coats on hooks, a designated towel on a nail, and a small jug with a spout on a stool for hand washing. Soap and wipes stayed sealed until use. For the bathroom, a lidded 5-gallon bucket lined with a heavy-duty bag sat behind a hanging curtain with a sack of pine shavings to keep the smell down. Talia pointed at it and said, "No exceptions. We use the shavings every time." I nodded because dysentery in a 400-square-foot cabin is a slow, messy way to die. A supply run to the cottage was mandatory, and it had to be fast. Before leaving, curtains stayed closed, the stove got turned down to coals, and the bridge got checked plank by plank. The boards were slick as ice, and the handrail felt colder than it should. Halfway across, a faint scrape came from the trail side, like something shifting in the wet brush. Talia froze, listened, and whispered, "No talking. Eyes up." We waited until the sound faded and the rain filled the space again. The cottage run felt like borrowing time. The village road was empty, yet a low, vibrating hum carried from somewhere toward the center. Inside, we moved in straight lines. I grabbed the solar panel, power banks, spare batteries, the hand crank radio, and extra propane cylinders. Then I went for the weight, the heavy airtight bin of bulk staples, 20 pounds of rice, dried beans, and flour that we kept for someday. It was heavy, but it bought us months, not weeks. Talia raided the bathroom and cleaning closet, adding disinfectant, extra gloves, and bandage wrap to her bag. She said, "Wet skin breaks down fast. Trench foot is real, and we're not getting it." From the locked gun cabinet, we took our firearms and ammo, a 12-gauge pump shotgun and a .22 rifle, and kept them unloaded but accessible as we packed. On the way out, something on the porch caught my eye, a mark on the wet wood of the railing drawn in ash or charcoal. It was a simple loop with a short line bisecting it, like a symbol someone could make in one quick motion. It wasn't a kid's doodle, it was too deliberate. Talia stepped closer without touching it and said, "That wasn't here last night. Someone was standing right here." A wet rag wiped it into a gray smear, and the rag went straight into a tied trash bag. Back at the lake cabin, my stomach tightened. The same symbol sat on the landside post of the bridge, faint but fresh, as if someone had traced it with a soot-stained thumb. Nobody had crossed our bridge while we were awake, and we'd heard nothing in the dark except rain. Talia kept her voice low and said, "Someone is coming down here. They found the trail and they marked the gap. They know there's a way across." The instinct was to call out, to challenge it, but calling out is how you invite answers you don't want. The mark got wiped away again, and we kept the curtains sealed tight. That evening, the drizzle turned into driving rain, and the lake wind pushed it sideways against the walls. While feeding the stove, an orange glow appeared across the water on the far bank. It was low and steady, then dipped, then flared again. It wasn't lightning. It was a small fire, covered and controlled, like someone trying to be seen by a specific person. Talia came to the window, kept the curtain almost closed, and said, "That's a signal. They're letting us know they're settling in." Dinner was silent. Later, as the stove ticked and the rain kept going, footsteps seemed to move on the trail side, slow and careful, stopping when we stopped. No voices called out. No one knocked. It was just enough to say we weren't alone, and just subtle enough to make it hard to tell whether we were being watched or tested. When sleep finally took me, the last thought was plain and heavy. Whoever made that symbol knew where the path ended, and they were coming back. By the next morning, the symbol wasn't just a question anymore, it was an escalation. A new mark appeared on a flat rock near the trailhead, clean and dark against the wet stone, and 3 small sticks were stacked directly under it like a directional arrow pointing at us. Whoever was doing it wanted us to notice, and more importantly, they wanted us to know they could come within touching distance without being seen. The footbridge immediately transformed from an asset into a fatal weak point. It was a straight, uninterrupted run from the land to our front door, and if the wrong person or group stepped onto it, there was nowhere to back up. Talia watched the shoreline through a narrow slit in the heavy curtain, her face tight, and said, "If they can reach the bridge, they can reach the door. And if they reach the door, we're cornered." She turned to me and added, "So we changed the math. We cut the bridge." The heavy cardboard box we'd hauled down from the cottage finally had a purpose. I dumped it out on the table, the heavy-duty boat winch, the spool of galvanized steel cable, 2 massive industrial hinges, and a box of lag screws thick enough to anchor a dock. The plan was simple but labor-intensive. Turn the final 8-foot section of the footbridge into a drawbridge. When it was raised, it would leave a gap of open air and deep water between the cabin and the land. No walkway means no quiet approach, and anything slow and mindless on the ground stays stuck on the ground. The work was brutal. Wet, pressure-treated lumber is slicker than ice, and a slip meant a fall into freezing water or onto the rocks below. I tied a safety rope around my waist and anchored it to the main door frame. Talia stayed right at the threshold, a headlamp aimed low at my hands to cut the gloom. She kept her voice steady, cutting through the sound of the rain, and said, "Talk to me while you're out there. I need to know you're working, not falling." I answered with a quick, "I'm good, still drilling." Every few minutes, mostly to keep her heart rate down. It took hours. We had to saw through the stringers, which felt wrong, like cutting our own umbilical cord. 2 boards came up first to make room for the mechanism. The hinges went on the cabin side where the frame was strongest, bolted into the main structural beam. We reinforced the lifting section with a cross brace so it would rise as a solid panel instead of twisting. The hardest part was mounting the winch inside the cabin for safety. I had to drill a pass-through hole in the log wall for the cable. We rigged a pulley above the door, ran the steel line out, and clipped it to the far end of the bridge section. When I finally cranked the handle, the gears clicked, a heavy mechanical sound, and the wood groaned. The panel rose a few inches, then a foot, then vertical. When it cleared the landside ledge, a clean, impassable gap opened up. Water and jagged rock waited below. Talia leaned out just enough to look at the void and said, "That drop is real. Nothing crosses that without wings." She nodded once and added, "Good." Locking it mattered as much as lifting it. I drilled a hole through the winch bracket and the gear, sliding a thick steel pin through it when the bridge was fully raised. A padlock held the pin in place. The winch carried the weight, but the lock ensured no one could force the handle to spin in reverse. When the bridge was up, our front door faced empty space. When it was down, it was a normal bridge again, but now it had rules. Those rules turned into religion. The bridge stayed up by default. It came down only for planned supply runs, and it went back up the second we were across. No loading gear while standing on the bridge. No stopping in the middle to chat. If someone slipped, the other person anchored them. They didn't rush out and create a second casualty. Talia said it while wiping rain from the new cable. We don't turn one mistake into 2. That's how we die. By late afternoon, the drizzle eased and the silence returned, allowing sound to carry farther. That was when the first slow shape showed up on the land near the trail bend. It wasn't running or searching. It wandered into view like it had followed the path of least resistance, head down, shoulders rounded, clothes dark with mud. From the window, it looked like a drunk man until it lifted its face, and the jaw hung open in a slack, broken way that signaled no intelligence. Talia stood beside me watching the figure and said, "That one doesn't look cold. It doesn't look like it feels anything at all." The figure took a few stiff, jarring steps, stopped at the start of the bridge where the wood used to continue, and stared ahead like it couldn't process the gap. It reached out and pressed its gray palms against the last post on the land side, then just stayed there swaying as if waiting for the road to repair itself. We didn't fire. Silence was our primary defense. We watched for 10 minutes until it lost interest, turned slowly and drifted back toward the tree line. The lesson was clear. Anything on the ground could find our trail by accident, but a human could find it on purpose. The next message arrived on wood. A scrap of paper had been jammed into a gap in the railing on the land side, protected enough from the rain that the ink hadn't washed away. In the morning light, the words were still readable. "You can't hide from cleaning." The letters were neat, almost careful, written by a steady hand. Below it sat the ash symbol, darker and larger than before. Talia read it once through the binoculars and said, "That's not a random passerby, that's a doctrine." She scanned the wet tree line, looking for movement, and added, "They're coming in quiet and they think they're doing something righteous. That makes them dangerous." My first urge was to shout back across the gap, to tell them to get the hell off our land, but shouting turns a hidden cabin into a beacon. So we answered without talking. The curtains stayed tight all day. A second deadbolt went on the door. I rigged a thin line of fishing monofilament from the landside post to a small brass bell tucked under a board on our side. If anyone stepped close enough to inspect the gap, the line would trip and we'd hear the chime even over the rain. The bell wasn't loud, just a small metal click, but in our silent world it would sound like a gunshot. To keep our own noise down, I glued rubber strips between the metal parts of the winch and wrapped the handle in duct tape so it wouldn't clank against the housing. On our next fast trip to the cottage, we staged it to look looted and abandoned. A cabinet door left hanging open, empty cans scattered on the counter, nothing of value left in sight. The shotgun stayed by the bench now, unloaded but with a box of shells open next to it. The rule remained: no firing unless the door is breached. That evening, the far bank fire returned, brighter and closer than before, and a low rhythmic chant carried across the water in short bursts. The specific words got lost in the wind, but the cadence was unmistakable. It was a liturgy. Talia sat by the stove, her face calm in the firelight, and said, "They want us to come to them. They're inviting us." She waited a beat, listening to the chanting, and added, "We don't move toward people who think a plague is holy." The bridge handle stayed locked. The steel pin stayed in place. The cabin stayed dark, and outside the lake kept swallowing the rain. The first supply run back toward the village wasn't heroic. It was a wet, anxious slog with a mental checklist and one hard rule: get exactly what we need and get back behind the water before anyone notices a pattern. The bridge came down just long enough to let us cross, then I cranked it back up immediately, the steel pin clicking into place with a sound that had become our definition of safety. The trail to the cottage looked different after only a day of neglect. The mud held shapes longer, and every smear or footprint felt like a note left for someone else to read. Talia kept her headlamp off and walked by, feel under the dripping trees. When a branch snapped somewhere uphill, she stopped dead, listened, and said, "Let the rain cover it. Don't move until the sound is gone." We waited until the drizzle thickened into a hiss, then moved again. The cottage was still intact. No broken glass, no forced door. That should have felt like a win. Instead, it felt like a countdown. We moved fast. Canned food went into a heavy tote. More rope and a second heavy-duty padlock came off the shelf. I grabbed a roll of thick plastic sheeting, a box of nails, and a hatchet, because quiet work is easier when you're not swinging a full-sized felling axe. Talia filled a waterproof bag with nitrile gloves, saline, antiseptic, and the few antibiotics we kept for emergencies. She zipped it tight and said, "If anyone gets cut in this weather, infection kills them before the fever does." We treat everything immediately. On the way out, the ash symbol was back, this time drawn on the inside of the porch rail, where you could only see it if you were standing on the deck boards. Someone had been close enough to lean in against the wall and draw without rushing. A folded strip of paper sat under the drawing, weighed down by a small pebble. The message was short: "Come out, be clean." Talia didn't touch it. She stared at the handwriting, then said, "They're not asking anymore. That's an instruction." The paper got pinched with a gloved hand and dropped into the cold stove for a quick burn later. We avoided the main lane on the return trip. A longer, overgrown route cut behind the neighbors' gardens and along a fence line that kept us out of sight. Even with the rain, the village carried noise now. Low, indistinct voices, an engine coughing to life and dying, and one sharp, jagged scream that ended too abruptly. The silence after that scream made my shoulders lock up. A slow figure drifted near an old potting shed, moving like a person who had forgotten why knees bend. It bumped into the fence, then turned its head in a lazy, confused arc, pale face, dark, wet mouth. It didn't see us. We stayed crouched behind a hedge, breathed shallow, and let it wander past. When it was gone, Talia whispered, "Back to the cabin. Now." Her voice had that clinic edge that means no debate. Crossing the bridge on the return felt worse because the loaded bags threw off our balance. Halfway across, our trip bell gave one small click from the land side, not loud, just a metallic snap that cut through the rain. Talia froze with one hand on the cable and said, "Someone stepped near the post. We're not alone." We finished the last steps in a rush, and I spun the winch handle until the gap opened wide again. We waited inside with the curtains drawn tight. No knock came. No voice called out. After a long, stretching minute, shapes moved at the trail bend, then another set behind them. Not the infected. People. 3 of them spaced out, hoods up, moving with a slow, calm gait like they owned the pace of the night. One carried a kerosene lantern with the wick turned low, more of a glow than a beam, and nobody looked lost. The lead person stopped at the rock edge where the bridge used to meet the land, looked across the gap of dark water and raised a hand like a neighborly greeting. A voice carried over the water, gentle and steady, almost soothing. "You don't need to live like animals out there. The rain is washing the world. Come out and be counted among the living." Behind the leader, the others made a synchronized gesture with their hands, something like a prayer or a sign. Talia stayed well back from the window glass and kept her voice flat. "We're not talking to them, we don't acknowledge them." The curtains stayed shut. The lantern glow lingered for a long time, then drifted away, slow and patient, like they were sure we just needed time to think about it. The mistake happened later during a second, hurried trip to grab the last of the firewood before dark. We were halfway up the trail when the weather played a trick on us. The wind died instantly and the heavy rain stopped cold, leaving a sudden ringing silence in the woods, a dead calm. In that vacuum of sound, a heavy twig snapped behind us, sharp and incredibly close, maybe 10 feet away. I spun around and I stepped between Talia and the tree line without thinking. My mouth opened before my brain caught up with the silence, and I said, "Talia, get behind me." I didn't shout it, but in that dead air my voice projected like a bell. Nothing moved, no one answered. But the forest holds sound, and I knew right away I'd given away something I couldn't take back. The rain started again a second later, crashing down, but the damage was done. Talia's eyes met mine in the gloom and she said, "You just handed them my name." There was no anger in it, just a flat, brutal fact. Night came early. The rain turned into a steady, hard sheet. Then the far bank fire lit again, closer than before, and a voice floated across the water, soft like a lullaby, perfectly audible. "Talia," it said once, and my stomach dropped. It said it again, slower, testing the weight of it. "Talia, come be clean." Talia sat on the bench by the stove, hands wrapped white-knuckle tight around a cold mug, and said, "They were close enough to hear you breathe. That means they're close enough to watch us sleep." The bridge stayed up, the cabin stayed dark, and sleep didn't come easy after that. The fire across the water kept returning, small and controlled, like a signal meant for us and no one else. Some nights it was just a low orange ember burning behind the reeds, and it always died the moment we moved a curtain, as if they were waiting for a reaction. The cabin ran on strict, silent routine. Curtains closed tight, stove fed in small intervals, lights kept low or off. The bridge stayed up and pinned unless we were actively crossing. Even with those precautions, the place felt watched because sound carries over water like it's traveling through a wire. One evening, the trip bell on the landside post clicked twice, slow and spaced out, like someone was testing the tension of the line. Talia stood near the stove, kept her voice barely audible, and said, "They're back at the post." A calm voice floated over the gap, close enough that it didn't need to shout to be heard clearly. "Talia Harker," it said. Hearing her full name coming from the dark trees made my stomach tighten into a knot. They must have checked the mailbox at the upper cottage. The voice continued, steady and practiced, like a preacher who had said this 1,000 times. "You don't have to hide in the dark. The rain is washing the world clean. Come out and be counted." No answer came from us. The curtain stayed closed. The voice waited, let the silence stretch, and then added, "We can see your light even when you think we can't." That line was a lie, a fishing expedition because we kept the cabin blackout dark, but it did exactly what it was meant to do. It planted doubt. Through a thin razor-width crack in the curtain, I saw them. 3 figures standing in the rain, hoods up, hands held open and empty to show they were peaceful. A 4th figure stayed back under the tree line with a lantern held low. They just waited there, patient as stones. The shotgun case came out from under the bench. I slid the shells into the side pouch by feel, and the gun stayed pointed at the floor as I moved. The goal wasn't to threaten, it was to be ready if the conversation ended and the breaching began. Talia picked up the .22 rifle and held it close to her chest, moving carefully to avoid clacking the barrel against the table. The voice returned, softer now, pitched like someone talking to a scared dog. "We know you're tired," it said. "We know you're hungry. We can help you carry the weight of this." A pause then. "All you have to do is lower the bridge, just step out." They weren't here to raid us for supplies, they were here for agreement. People like that don't get bored and leave, they get convinced they are saving you. The next morning, a new message sat on the landside post, pinned with a rusty nail we hadn't left there. The paper was soaked through, but the ink held. It read, "We will bring you to the water." Under it, the ash symbol was thicker, drawn with a wet, soot-stained finger. Talia read it once through the binoculars and said, "That's a promise, not a warning." We kept the day quiet and frantically useful. Wood got split and stacked under cover. We checked the bridge hardware twice, tightened every bolt on the winch, and kept moving, because standing still made the cabin feel like a cage. Late afternoon brought the worst sign. The far bank fire lit, then a second fire blinked on farther down the shoreline, then a third. They weren't random campfires. They were spaced apart like military markers. Talia watched through the smallest gap in the curtain and said, "That's not a patrol, that's a group." Footsteps hit the landside, heavier and more numerous than before, and the bell rang in a fast, violent burst. Not a test, a rush. The calm voice carried again, closer and sharper this time. "Lower the bridge," it commanded. "Let the washing happen." Behind that voice, another person called out, "Talia, we heard you. We know you're in there." A hard metal-on-wood tug hit the landside railing and the raised panel of the bridge shuddered. Someone was pulling from the wrong side, looking for a weakness in the hinges. The steel pin held, the padlock held, the winch cable went taut and hummed like a guitar string. Talia stepped back from the window and said, "If they break that hardware, we lose the gap." The shotgun was in my hands now, safety off, barrel still down until the last possible second. The curtain moved a fraction, just enough to see without showing our faces. 4 people stood at the edge of the drop. One held a short steel pry bar. Another gripped a hatchet. The leader stood with empty hands, shoulders squared, still acting like this was a negotiation. He looked up toward our door and said, "You can't keep sin behind a lock. We're here to help you cross." Behind them, slow, shambling shapes drifted between the trees, pale and stiff, drawn by the shouting and the fires. The cult didn't flinch at them. If anything, they used them, letting the infected shuffle closer like extra pressure to force us out. The leader raised his chin and called, "Talia," and the way he said it sounded like he thought he owned the name. "Come out, bring Tobias, we'll keep you safe." A beat later he added, "Don't be the last 2 dirty people on this lake." Talia moved beside me, eyes steady, and said, "They're not coming in." Her voice stayed low and flat as she added, "If they start cutting, we stop them." The first real attempt came fast. The hatchet swung at the galvanized cable where it ran down toward the landside attachment. Metal rang on metal, sparks flew, and the cable jumped. Another person grabbed the underside of the raised panel with the pry bar and yanked, trying to lever it down. The whole bridge shook violently. The shotgun came up, and the sound that followed cut through the rain like a slammed door. The hatchet dropped instantly. The person holding it stumbled back, boots skidding on wet rock, and went over the edge into the lake with a heavy splash. The heavy current, swollen by weeks of rain, grabbed him instantly and pulled him downstream, away from our intake. The leader froze, shocked by how fast the violence had arrived. A second shot cracked, and another figure toppled the same way, arms flailing for a split second before the dark water swallowed them. A third person surged forward, lunging for the cable as if speed could beat physics, and the .22 popped from Talia's side, quick and sharp. That person jerked, lost footing on the slick stone, and slid off the ledge. 3 bodies in the lake meant one clear thing. This wasn't a conversation anymore. The rest of them broke and ran, the lantern bouncing wildly, boots slipping in the mud, voices turning into short, panicked noises as they disappeared into the rain. Inside, the cabin went quiet again, except for the drumming of the rain and the ticking of the stove. Talia kept the rifle up for one long second, aiming at the empty tree line, then lowered it and said, "They'll tell themselves we're monsters now." I lowered the shotgun barrel and answered, "Let them tell it, as long as they tell it from far away." The night after the shots, sleep came in jagged chunks. Rain kept tapping the metal roof, the stove ticked rhythmically as it cooled and warmed, and the lake made that heavy slapping sound against the cliff when the wind pushed water into stone. Nothing came back to the bridge. No voices, no lights. That silence should have felt like relief, but mostly it felt like proof that the world had shifted on its axis and wasn't shifting back. Morning light showed the same cabin, the same dripping trees, and the same gray water, but the air inside felt different. This place wasn't a weekend escape anymore. It was a defensive line and a routine we had to keep clean and steady if we wanted to make it through the winter. Talia moved without hurrying, poured hot water into the wash jug and said, "Hands first, then coffee." It was a clinic habit, ingrained and non-negotiable. That habit mattered more than any motivational speech because habits keep panic from taking the wheel. The bridge stayed up by default. When it had to come down for a supply run, it came down with a tactical plan. A list went on the table, we picked one task and we did it fast. No wandering, no checking the village just to see if things had changed. Curiosity is just a good way to get stranded on the wrong side of your own gap. A second trip bell went on the land post, doubled up for redundancy. Work inside the cabin became boring in the best possible way. Wood got split under the overhang, then moved to a dry stack by the stove, one day's worth at a time. Damp clothes came off at the door, then went on hooks where stove heat could reach them without turning the whole room into a sauna. The hygiene setup stayed strict. Boots in the tub, hands washed before touching food, wipes sealed, and the bathroom bucket lined and covered with fresh pine shavings to keep the smell down. Talia treated cleanup like her job and said, "If you wouldn't leave it on the counter at the clinic, don't leave it in our air here." Water ran on a simple cycle. Rain went into a clean bin, then through a gravity filter, then into capped bottles. Lake water stayed as a backup, and after what went into the water the night before, we were careful to draw it from the upstream side of the cabin and boil it aggressively. Food stayed simple too. The heavy bin of rice and beans we'd hauled down gave us a baseline. We supplemented it with cans and whatever we could pull from the lake without making noise. Some mornings the net came up empty and we ate plain oatmeal. Other mornings it came up with enough fish to stretch the pantry and make dinner feel almost normal again. Power was treated like a temporary gift. The solar panel came out when the sky lightened and went away the second clouds thickened. Phones stayed off. One lantern lived on the low setting, and at night even that went dark unless there was a medical reason. Curtains stayed closed after sunset. From across the water, the cabin needed to look like nothing more than a shadow under the rock. The hardest part wasn't the cold or the manual labor. It was the way people still lived in our heads after we stopped seeing them. Every bell click tightened the chest. Every distant shout from the village direction turned into a question. And questions can pull you outside if you let them. Talia said it one night while we listened to the rain hammering the roof. "We can't save everybody and we can't die trying. That math doesn't work." The words landed heavy, but they were honest, and honest beats hopeful when hope gets you killed. Slow shapes still drifted along the ground, drawn by trails and noise. They showed up at the land side, stared at the gap in the bridge like it was a physics problem they couldn't solve, then wandered off into the brush. They were a threat you could manage if you respected distance and kept quiet. People were different. People remembered. People planned. After what happened at the bridge, anyone who heard the story would label us as selfish or dangerous or both. That didn't matter. Labels don't change hunger, and hunger is what pushes strangers into your yard. Late fall crept closer. The nights bit harder. The stove ran longer and the wood stack shrank faster. We used brighter mornings to haul the last useful scraps from the cottage, and every trip looked the same. Bridge down, cross, bridge up, move fast, return, bridge up again. The cottage stayed as a decoy, looking half-used and unimportant. If someone broke in, they'd find leftovers and wet furniture, not our life. Sometimes, when the lake went still for an hour, Talia sat with her mug and stared at the waterline. She didn't talk much in those moments. Breathing was the point, like borrowing peace before the next noise. On mornings like that, the cabin almost felt like it used to. A quiet place built for two people who just needed rest. Then a bell would click, or a distant glow would flicker across the far bank and the spell would break. We talked about what comes next in short, practical sentences. Talia asked once, "If the road's clear, do we go back?" And the answer came out slow because it wasn't really about roads. I said, "Corn, not until we know what this thing is doing and not until crowds stop acting like traps." She nodded, then added, "So we build winter habits and stop wishing for summer." That became the conclusion, whether we liked it or not. A safe place isn't magic, it's maintenance. It's the boring choices you make when you're tired and the rules you follow when nobody is watching. Keep the bridge up, keep the cabin dark, keep your hands clean, keep enough heat to stay dry. Don't trade your life for somebody else's bad plan. Tomorrow we'll split more wood, check the locks again, refill the water bottles, and listen to the rain, because the season isn't done with us yet. If you enjoyed the story, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're listening from. See you in the next one.